the cloud. I put it there, right? All right, so we're going to do an interview panel. We have a few people on the call. I guess Patrick must be one of them. And well,
did you want me to do intros, Rylan? Sorry.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, great. So 3 people have volunteered, and these are all either hiring managers, senior developers, or sometimes both. And definitely been people who've been on both sides of the hiring table. And I want to thank Jossie McManus, who actually recruited all these folks. So she actually had someone made a comment a couple of months ago about interviewing and how hard it was. And she said, that's interesting. I want to dig into that more. And she actually recruited Patrick and Paul and Brooke. So thank her if you see her. And I wanted to explicitly thank her before we started. Paul is a software engineer at Google, Paul Christopher. Patrick Armentrout is a software engineering manager. Right now he's at HomeAdvisor. And Brooke is a longtime Boulder Ruby member, probably a familiar face to some of you all. And he is focused right now on the Alchemists Collective, which is really focusing on the craft of software engineering. So I want to thank all 3 of the panelists. And I think, Rylan, you are going to moderate, correct?
Yep, if I can push on mute. So happy to.
So Rylan will be moderating. We have some questions kind of staged, but you know, we want this to be a place where people can ask questions of these experienced engineers as well.
Yep.
I'll pass over to Rylan.
Yeah, and please drop them in the chat if you have anything that comes up while they're answering any questions, or you want to just have a random question be asked. That's kind of the point of a virtual panel, I guess, is sort of have experts who talk about this, and then we all weigh in. It makes it easy, and it's kind of fun.
Hey,
yeah, I guess.
Rylan?
Oh, go ahead, Brooke.
Oh, sorry, Rylan. Since I'm on audio only, I'll need your eyes. So if you just let me know when you need me to jump in.
Sure. That's going to be an interesting moderating job, but I'll do my best. But let's start with from the candidate side. As someone who is interviewing, what are some red flags or actions to avoid? And Brooke, since you're talking last, let's go with you.
Thanks, Rylan.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So, yeah. Hi, everyone. This is Brooke. I apologize that I'm just on audio, but yeah, there's several things there. Usually, what I'm looking for, especially in kind of like the first part of the interview, right? Like the kind of meet and greet, is, you know, just being able to show up on time, being punctual. Also, you know, in these days, right, with COVID, and even before then when doing remote work, especially me, I've done a lot of remote work and worked in distributed teams. Is also just making sure your environment's clean and tidy as well. But then also being able to, you know, be able to talk about the subject matter. You know, if your language of choice is Ruby or some other language, just being able to, you know, speak elegantly about what it is that you know about the craft, and you know, if you don't know things, being able to say, hey, you know, you don't know what those are, and that's okay to say that, right? So. And also, you know, just having like a portfolio, or resumes are really good, but portfolios are really nice too. Just being able to get to know what it is that you're passionate about, the things that you're into, and the things you're exploring. Kind of a lot of the things that have been kind of discussed even earlier in this meetup, right? Is just having the passion for the craft, always constantly learning, and constantly growing.
Okay. Patrick?
Yeah, I think it's a good question from the candidate side, because it's difficult to figure out when you are the candidate interviewing, you know, if it is going to be a good fit for you. I think it's really important for candidates to go into an interview thinking that they're interviewing the company as well, which is, I know everyone says that, it's really tough to think about because you're always thinking about like, I want to impress this, but thinking that like you're interviewing the company at the same time. And I think in terms of red flags, the biggest one from me, from a candidate side, is, I guess, like, if there's smoke, there's fire, and try not to overlook it no matter how much you like the job. I went to work for this company where they said, you know, hey, this is a rough culture coming in, but we're trying to fix it. Don't worry. And you get in there and it's a rough culture, and they weren't able to, you know, there wasn't much that they could have done to fix it at that point. And I think understanding that, and understanding that, just trying to make sure that it's a cultural fit and it's a place that you're going to want to be every day is what I would try and suss out from the candidate side. It's a good question, Dan. Yeah, rough culture in terms of basically having a culture where you have coworkers who are respectful of your opinions. You have basically a good maybe mentoring structure in place. You have somewhere where you're going to be able to have maybe a good architectural discussion, but you're not going to be steamrolled by someone with an ego, basically. And I think that can be sometimes rare in our industry, and making sure that you find a place like that where you are respected is not as easy as it should be sometimes.
Sort of add on there, I think like a good thing that you sort of cued in my head is like, pay attention to the gut feelings that you have while you're interviewing, where it's like, that was weird. And if you start getting a lot of those, like, it's important to like kind of add those up and be like, this seems like something's a little odd. I mean, it's nice that they told you heads up, like, it's a rough culture, so at least you knew, but still.
That's a good point, though. Yeah, listen to your gut.
Yeah, and it's always okay to walk away. It's interesting about the rough culture. And then I missed the third person. Where are they on?
I'm here. Can you guys hear me, by the way? This is actually my first time using Zoom.
Yep.
So in terms of red flags, I look at interviewing as we are trying to extract a number of parameters from the candidate. That's a variety of technical skills, soft skills, etc. So there's not a whole lot of red flags. Like, it's more about positive signals than negative signals, in my opinion. I think, like, the one thing I would say is that different companies interview differently, there's different processes, different expectations, etc. And so you should do your research. Like, I think the only way to really miss things in a way that would be construed as a red flag is to not really know the expectations of what the company or the interviewers are looking for. For instance, I talk with a lot of like fresh graduates from local universities that are, entering the field and looking at interviewing. And one of the things that often comes up is, like, for in-person interviews, pre-COVID, like, should they, dress up and be presentable, et cetera. And if you're, interviewing for the average tech company, the response that I would give is, like, don't put any thought into what you're going to wear. Like, if you spend more than 2 or 3 minutes deciding what outfit you should wear to your interview, that's too much time, and you should spend that effort and time on just doing more preparation, et cetera, because tech companies aren't going to care. But if you're interviewing for a bank, or a company that's more traditional in one way or another, then, wearing a suit and kind of being more formal might have more of a implication. And so I think as long as you kind of, like, take the time to talk to your recruiter and set the proper expectations, then it's really hard to, have a red flag in the way that would completely, tank the interview for you.
Yeah, and I think to add on to your, like, choosing what you're going to wear, it depends on what kind of software job you're going for. So it's like, I interviewed somebody recently, and I'm sort of interjecting myself in this panel, but hopefully it guides it a little bit. And they looked a little disheveled, and it was just sort of like, do you care about this job? Like, there's a little bit of a, like, hey, maybe take a shower, brush your hair, put on a casual button-up.
Yep.
Hey, this is
my favorite anecdote here is I have a coworker who actually worked with at my previous company before my current position, and on his interviewing, he was interviewing on Halloween, And when he came in for interview, he was dressed like a pirate because that was his Halloween costume. And he got the job, and he's a great employee. And it's you know, it's the type of thing that like especially being in the Boulder office, like if you show up for your interview in like full biking gear, like that is not going to fly at like a traditional, you know, finance company or a bank or something like that. But in a tech company in Boulder, you know, like if you bike to the interview and that's just the gear that you had on, the companies probably aren't going to care too much. You know, it might even be a positive. So it's really just about kind of like understanding the role that you're interviewing for. Like there's dozens of different ways that companies do the interview process, signals they look for, et cetera. And so really what I recommend is just like, you know, research the company, talk with your recruiter, and kind of understand what those expectations are.
Yeah, that's a great addendum there. My partner Annie is with us. She's in HR, so she's listening in and has an addendum as well.
I would just say that if you're just on this what to wear to an interview discussion, if you're on the fence, I would pick the more presentable or more higher level of dress than the lower one. I've interviewed a lot of people, and even though it's always been in a very casual environment, if someone shows up in a blazer for a lab tech role, I remember them.
It's a differentiation.
They may show up in jeans and a t-shirt for the rest of their career, but I still remember that they wore a blazer to their interview. So I wouldn't put a ton of thought into it, but if you're thinking about button-up shirt or not, I would go button-up. Just my addendum there.
Yeah. Surprise HR is on the call. And yeah, I'll just sort of circle back around. I think you all, do you have anything you want to add on? Maybe I jumped on top of you, Patrick.
Oh no, I was going to agree with the basically the choosing between interview dress. I think I'm never going to knock anyone if I'm interviewing them if they're, you know, somewhat underdressed or what they're dressed basically. But I think the other thing to consider too is, at least when I'm in the interview seat and when you are interviewing, sometimes when you decide to go a little bit more formal, you can feel more comfortable. So it's also a part of like, what are you going to wear that's going to make you feel most comfortable for this interview, so you can really show yourself off.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Like, and that's where I say, like, if you spend more than 5 minutes thinking about what to wear, like that's kind of where I would cut it off. Like, just pick what's comfortable, spend that time preparing for the interview itself. Like, it shouldn't be something that you're stressing about for an hour, you know, trying to figure out and, you know, A/B testing things with your friends.
Yep.
Fair. So it sort of had like a both of the red flags from both sides, because it was kind of a what's the candidate, what's the company side red flags. Brooke, do you want to add anything on there from either perspective as far as like what you should be looking for from the company or the candidate side, or those red flags?
Yeah, thanks, Rylan. Yeah, I guess from the company side, you know, it's really kind of knowing, you know, there's a bunch of things that you kind of want to go through there when you're kind of interviewing the company. You know, what is the work-life balance? You know, kind of echoing what some of the other panelists were saying, right? Like, does it fit with kind of what you're looking for? Work-life balance, you know, what is the, you know, typical day look like? What does the week look like? What does the team structure look like? Do they have like weekly iterations, bi-weekly iterations? You know, what, just try to get a sense of, well, what does life there look like, right? What do they use for collaboration and communication? What kind of tools? You know, pairing, you know, how's code review performed? Definitely digging into their tech stack, you know, just trying to understand, like, okay, well, what is your tech stack, right? Like, what are your servers? What are your databases? What is the code that I'll be needing to use on a daily basis? And then also just dig into even more of that, like understanding, well, okay, do you have good code quality checks and linter tools within your code base? Do you have CI? Do you have metrics and monitoring? exception monitoring as well. Like all these things that are really critical to knowing whether you're stepping into a position that has a high standard of quality and good good engineering regimen is really nice to know. And even if it's kind of a little lower on the bar, right? You can kind of dive into that when you're talking to the company, and figure out, hey, are you wanting somebody like me to come in and actually help level up that bar, or is this just something you've been sweeping under the rugs and you don't care? And that might be a warning sign, that might be a red flag to be like, well, okay, this might not be a good career path for me, might not be a place where I can actually level up and grow. Anyway, sorry, that's kind of focusing on the company side. I'll just pause there just in case anybody else wants to jump in.
Yeah, and I think it's a good segue to sort of what Elise was asking, was how do you suss out kind of a rougher culture or whatnot without being rude? And Patrick, I want to kind of focus that towards you as far as, are those questions you could have asked beforehand that would have given you a little bit more of the like insight into the red flags?
Yeah, I think from the candidate side, the questions that I would ask there are basically like, what are your expectations especially if you're talking to someone who might be your manager, what are your expectations as a manager? What are your expectations from a team perspective? How would you want the team to basically approach an architecture problem? And you might be able to suss out some stuff that way. If it's lean more towards, well, this person is the only one that knows this, so they're just going to figure it out, right? And it might be like, okay, this is maybe a culture where people are a little bit more siloed in their roles. Or is this going to be like, how would you go about solving this problem as a team? And then from the interviewer side, I'll usually try to suss that out with questions of, like, my favorite question that I like to ask is, okay, say we have 5 software engineers in a room, and 4 engineers think that architecture A is the best, and you know that architecture B is actually the best, and you know it 100%, but how do you handle this situation? And seeing basically of like, can the candidate recognize that there's a chance that they might be wrong and that they might not have the right answer, even though they're 100% correct? Or is it going to be like, well, I'm just going to try and convince everyone else? I had one candidate one time who I asked him that, and he's like, well, I'm going to wear you down over a series of months, and if you still don't like it, I'm going to tell you I told you so 6 months later. So I'm like, okay, you sound pleasant. So I think those are some questions I'll usually ask, is more of like teamwork, disagreement. Can you recognize if there's a chance that, you might not have the correct answer at some point?
Paul, just before I turn it over to you there, Caleb just asked in the chat, what should candidates do if they're poor at working with someone who is watching? Is it okay to request time alone with the problem? I just want to cover that because I think it's super helpful. But I also want to just sort of say, like, from the company side, what are questions that you would ask candidates? Because I think that's important. And sort of saying, like, what's your process company? How do you suss out if they'll fit into your team? That was a long-winded question of 2 parts. So good luck.
Yeah, such a good question. So typically when I talk to people about interviewing, the number one piece of advice that I give to people is to understand where the person interviewing them is coming from, which first requires knowledge of who that person is. For companies that have a similar interview process to us, the people that are conducting your interviews, 1, it's multiple people, and 2, those people are typically engineers. They're not hiring managers, they're not from HR. They are people who, they were working on some code or working on a design or in a meeting, beforehand. They go to conduct the interview, and then after that, they return to their normal work. And the reason why I think that, like, knowing who that person is the most important factor, because understanding that, like, fundamentally the question that person is asking themselves is, as they're conducting the interview, is this somebody who would add value to my team? Like, if I had this person working next to me, is it somebody that I would feel, makes my job easier? Because if I get stuck on something, or if I need to offload a task on somebody, or whatever the case may be, like having that person on the team will add to the value to the team as a whole. And so once you kind of like understand that mindset of like, that's where, if you're being interviewed by engineers, that's where the engineers are coming from. I think a lot of questions like this kind of, you can kind of work out the answer for yourself. So like one of the things that we look at, it's not just like, do you get, like, I think there's this fundamental myth with technical interviews where it's like, the engineer is giving me a question, I have to write code for that question. And if I get the optimal algorithm with code that compiles, that outputs the correct answer in a reasonable amount of time, then I pass the interview, and that's a success. And if I don't do that, then it's a failure, and then all that's aggregated together, and then put through some formula and either get the job right up. And that's fundamentally wrong in the way that a lot of these processes work. There's a ton of different attributes that the interview is asking themselves about. To see how you work in an environment. They're looking at how do you ask questions? How do you respond to ambiguous requirements? What's your approach towards testing? And before you start coding, how do you work on design? How do you analyze trade-offs between complexity versus simple code? Do you look at things like, well, there's an easy brute force solution to this, so if it's not something that we're going to be doing all the time and it doesn't need to be performant, then there's a really easy low-hanging fruit to solve that problem. Like those are the types of signals that the interview is trying to extract. And if you look at like if I have a teammate and I'm stuck on something and I go over to somebody and I say, hey, I'm having a problem with this, I can't figure this out, and they say like, oh, there's a Java library that does that for you. Or there's a Ruby library, or there's some built-in code that you can just call that function and it's implemented by somebody incredibly smart and it just works and it gives you the right answer. Like that's the answer that I want from a teammate. I don't want them to come back and say like, oh, there's this crazy in-depth dynamic programming algorithm that you can use that was written in some paper I read in college that has a slightly more optimal solution to that. It might be interesting having that knowledge, but just having somebody that will solve that. Or will kind of help me in just day-to-day work. Like that's primarily the signal that I'm working for. So to answer Caleb's question about like if you're not comfortable working on a whiteboard, et cetera, like when I'm watching a candidate code on the whiteboard, I'm looking at questions like what do they call their variables? Are they just naming everything generic names, or are they naming them proper variables? Are they even concerned with what they call their variable names? Are they writing their code in a way that's going to be testable? How are they thinking through the problems? What assumptions are they making about the problem? Are they challenging those assumptions? Do they want clarifications on those assumptions? Now, those are really the signals that I'm trying to extract when I'm doing an interview. Like how you write code, what algorithms, like that is a signal, but it's one of, a dozen other signals. So from that standpoint, like hearing you think through the process, that's what I would prefer. Like if you're up there on a whiteboard or you're by yourself and you stare at something for 5 minutes and then you write perfect code on the whiteboard, that tells me a little bit about you, but it doesn't tell me as much as me hearing your thought process. Is you thinking through the problem, explaining what you're doing, asking questions, etc. And so I think in general, you should try to approach things in that way, talking out loud, asking questions, getting clarifications, because those are really the helpful signals. And this definitely doesn't come natural to a lot of people. Like there are people who are just, the way that they work is just kind of ingesting the problem in silence and then writing perfect code. And if you are that type of person, I would recommend just kind of practicing for that interview where you do talk out loud and you do ask questions and you do respond to questions, because overall that's going to give the interviewer a better signal than if you just hand them the right answer, because there's a lot more to the interview than just getting the right answer.
Yeah, so I sort of asked Caleb, and feel free to unmute if you would like to kind of follow up on that, Caleb, but it sounds like a good way to approach it is a little bit of practice and then engage the interviewer. And that's really important for showing the kind of team dynamics, and that may help make you be less, quote unquote, poor on that kind of whiteboarding thing. I'm not sure I could see like, hey, would you leave me in the room alone? That might be a little tough.
Yeah, and like one thing too is like the technical interview is a really bad format to make these kinds of decisions, but it's also kind of the best that we have. And people who interview, you know, like there's people that interview dozens or hundreds of candidates, and they're very aware of where questions get derailed, where the interesting parts of the questions are, you know, et cetera. And so, you know, they're going to know like how to steer people into the interesting parts of the question instead of doing stuff, you know, other random things. So like one example I always give is, you know, for like precondition checking on a function or a method that you're implementing. You know, you might say like, okay, here's the method that I'm going to implement. Like, here's the types of checks that I would do on the inputs to that function to see if they're valid or not. Like that's a skill that I want in my coworkers. You know, I want my coworkers to do proper sanitization and checking of inputs into the methods that they're implementing. And so you might just ask the interviewer, like, do you want me to write the code for this? Like, is that one of the signals that they're trying to extract? You know, watching you kind of like write the code for the different cases that you would check for, or are they comfortable with you just saying, you know, like, oh, I would check that this is greater than 0. I would check that this is non-null. You know, they might ask like, well, if that wasn't the case, would you throw an exception? Would you choose, you know, return something else? They might have you elaborate on that, but you might not necessarily have to write any code. And that's where having that conversation with the interviewer is more productive, because the interviewer knows what signals they're trying to extract. And the only way that they can do that is by having that conversation. If you just, you know, do it the way that you were going to do it and present that to them, that might hit the target of what they were looking for, but it's much more productive to kind of have that open dialogue with them.
Seems great. Patrick, do you have any add-ons there? Anything that triggered as you were listening?
No, I thought, I thought Paul definitely brought up some really good points in terms of it's not necessarily how well you can solve an algorithm. I had an interview a couple days ago where someone solved the algorithm perfect, but had trouble speaking to an overall architecture. But it's more of this basically larger thing of, you know, not only can you code, but can you speak about how you would build something out in a way and be able to work back and forth with the interviewer. I think one of the big technical questions that we like to do, and I like to do as well, but not just at HomeAdvisor, is like, okay, here's some large nebulous piece of software, whatever it is. Like, we need to build an app that helps you track your groceries. How would you approach building this application? What technology would you use? And then you can dig into the different areas like that of like, okay, we're going to set it up with Spring Boot API. How would you hook up your authentication scheme? What type of data store would you use? How would you use a 3-tiered architecture? And these are the real big things from a purely like technical perspective that I'm looking for. Of, can you identify what each one of, how the data transfer works between systems, and like, you know, how it builds an architecture that can scale and can work in multiple ways.
Great. Brooke, any addendums there before I move on to the next question?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I wanted to tap into that a little bit because there's a lot of good things said here, but the one thing I wanted to emphasize, and one of the main things I was really excited to be able to actually speak and kind of talk about this a little bit more tonight, is I think that our interviewing process is completely broken. It's been broken for many years, and it's, you know, this kind of like, you know, screen the interview, bring them in for a technical discussion, maybe even do a code sample, maybe even pair a whiteboard with them. And what I do these days is I don't do any of that anymore. There's always kind of like a first kind of meet and greet screening, right? Just want to know the candidate and kind of talk and understand their history and where they're coming from. And then look at their portfolio, right? Like if it's a resume, that's great. Or if it's a portfolio, like they have a bunch of open source work, or they've done other work that they can share that, you know, doesn't have any legal restrictions, right? Where you can kind of look at the architecture, look at the code, look how they've managed things over time is really good. But then after that, what I've been really pushing for in the industry recently, and even when I've been in hiring back when I was actually running my own startup, and now I'm trying to actually, you know, build up the Alchemist collective, is I actually want to work with them for about a week or more. And I know this is kind of sound a little radical, but what I really like about this is bringing them in, paying them for their time, right? Because as an interviewee, it's really hard trying to talk to various different companies, trying to figure out what their culture is, what their stack is, trying to deal with like crazy esoteric code challenges, or even like take-home assignments, right? Are fine too, but it's like, you know, you're just working for free. You're solving some other problem for some other company just to try to get into the door, right? And kind of what everybody else has been kind of talking on the panel here is, what I really wanted to do is make it more real, right? To make it an environment that is as close to reality as what you're going to get when you actually become a full-time employee with the company. And so what I like to do is, you know, bring them in for a week. You come in, we let you know, ramp up the stack that you're getting into, right? We'll have a setup script, and you'll be able to just like rapidly just, you know, clone the repo and then jump into the code, right? And then pick up some stories, right? We'll have some stuff kind of aligned for you. You pick them up, and you'll just start working on those, right? But during the course of that week, what I'm really looking for is your communication skills, right? Being a really good writer, really being able to figure out what the problem is, ask questions if you run into issues, see how you handle the problem, whether you pair up with other individuals, or maybe you go off on your own for a little bit, or it's a combination thereof, and really just kind of see how you work through it. By having good Git commits, right? Well-structured code, very atomic commits of like, you know, you're adding things, refactoring things, updating things, maybe removing some code along the way. And each one of those commits, I know some people might be kind of chuckling because the Ruby community knows that I'm really heavy on Git rebase and a good rebase workflow. But this all ties into that communication aspect, right? Because when I review the code, right, I need to be able to kind of like get into your head, kind of walk through what you were doing, why you're adding this, these bits of code, explain why you thought it was necessary, so that the review process is a lot faster, which also means that those PRs move through a lot quicker because we're not having a whole lot of discussion back and forth trying to figure out what you were doing and why you did what you did. We can actually, we can all read through it really easily and then just ask really good, poignant questions, right? And again, this is coming from me who's worked in a distributed environment, and most of us are working asynchronously and remotely. We're not on site, we're not in an office. And so being able to communicate really well is highly, highly valued. In fact, it's actually treasured. And so having that kind of discourse is really nice, seeing that back and forth, getting feedback, how you handle the feedback, how you actually refactor that feedback into your code and rebase it and clean it up, and then finally get that pushed out. But then what I'm looking for is, even though you got the feature out, I want to see how you handle like, well, hey, what happens if a production issue comes up? Or maybe something that wasn't caught, that none of us caught maybe in the review process. Like, are you able to actually help debug the issue that happened maybe in production, or maybe watching or monitoring of the stats? How you handled just carrying everything from start to finish and to completion. And then at the, you know, that's kind of through the course of the week, right? There'll be a couple of stories, a couple of issues that you might pick up. And then at the very end of the week, kind of at the evaluation phase, is really just syncing up and giving you a chance to kind of like demo your work to the team. Talk about what you did, talk about the things you learned, ask any other questions from us. We can ask more questions from you. I mean, during that time, all of us has been pairing with you, been working with you, getting a sense of who you are and what your strengths and weaknesses are and what you bring to the table to level up the team. And that's a really great way to have a two-way conversation, because one of the things that hasn't really been brought up here yet is this more of this two-way dialogue, right? Because in real life, when you're working with a team, it's you getting to know the team, whether you're a good, you know, whether the culture is right for you, and the, you know, the challenges and the tech stack and everything is aligned for what you want to do. But then at the same time, it's a great chance for us as a team to really come together and be like, yeah, you know, this person's really helped out here. They added some new ideas. They taught us some things. They really handled this really well. They took it all the way through. They're very, you know, disciplined, very structured. They show up every day. That's really good to know. And it's hard to suss out in just a kind of like an afternoon of interviewing, right? The traditional things that companies do these days is like maybe they take half an afternoon. You do like a cultural interview, you do a technical interview, or maybe you do an architectural interview, and then maybe you meet with like the CEO at the end, right? This spans it out, but also susses all those aspects out, because in just an afternoon or just a few hours of meeting somebody, sometimes you can't really determine that if they're of a sound character or professional etiquette or ethics. And it's really nice to have that time. And again, I keep talking about the candidate, but it's really important that the candidate has this time with the company too, because it's a two-way street. Because I don't want to be like 3 months down the road, or even a month, right, and find out, oh no, this candidate isn't who we thought they were, or the candidate didn't think the company is who they thought it was. And so that's a way to kind of get that sussed out sooner rather than later, and part ways early, if that's the case, in order to have a more stronger lasting relationship, right? And just create a culture that is, you know, around the people and the team and the joy that it goes with crafting good software and delivering a good product for our customers.
Yeah, that's a good, lots of good points in there. Annie, one quick add-on?
I just had one quick add-on, and Brooke, I love that model, and that's actually why I like to tell people that contract to hire is a good thing for both parties, because everyone gets to interview each other for a long term. But to Caleb's question, if I would suggest if you find yourself in that whiteboard situation and not able to be on the team for a week or more, that's a really good opportunity to kind of turn that psychology on its head and make that your own interview question. And look at how the team reacts when you say, hey, this makes me nervous. I'm going to walk you through my process, but I might be a little stilted. Or, hey, this makes me nervous. I might be silent for a little bit. And watch and see what those team members do. Do they respect that, or do they get frustrated? Because that's going to show you a lot about how that team dynamic is without actually asking a question about the team dynamic. That's it. I told Rylan I'd take 20 seconds.
So yeah, Patrick and Paul, I'd love to have you kind of weigh in on so some of what Brooke touched on, and then sort of what your interview process might look like and how it might have changed in the last few years. Because I thought that like a week in-house sounds really nice to like suss things out, but that's a lot of time, especially for someone with a job.
Yeah, so I can give some good anecdotes there. So I would agree that like the standard way of doing technical interviews as they're done by, you know, a majority of industry is definitely not optimal. I think it optimizes more on reducing the number of false positives as it does reducing false negatives, which is an issue that needs to be addressed. So I can tell you from like a data standpoint, like one of the things that changed at Google is if you go back not 5 years, but you know, maybe 15 years, it was known for this like brutal gauntlet of interviewing, where it was technical interviews like they're typically performed today, except instead of doing the 4 to 6 that's done today, there was somewhere on the order of like 15 or 16 or even up to 20 different interviews that you would do in order to make it into the company. And the reasoning behind that from the people who set up the process was that like, we want to hire the best people. If somebody can make it through this gauntlet of 15 interviews successfully, then they're going to be the best people. What changed about that was somebody went and they actually looked at some data. So they collected a bunch of, like, our interview process is very set up in a way to minimize the amount of bias that makes it through the system. So for instance, like each interviewer kind of writes up feedback, and then that's all aggregated and given to a committee that is nobody who actually interviewed you. And the committee looks at several candidates. And so they're based purely off the feedback from the interviewer and not the actual interview experience. And so they took a bunch of people that interviewed and they said like, okay, if we just have one data point and we gave it to the committee and the committee made a decision, would they make a hire or no hire decision? And was that the same as 15 interviews? What if we gave them 3 interviews, 5 interviews, 7 interviews, et cetera? So they took people who went through the full gauntlet, but then they took a subset of those number of interviews, gave it to the committees to see what the decision was, and then compared the decisions to the decisions from the full gauntlet. And what they discovered was that like just one interview, you have like somewhere around like a 60% accuracy. So if you just do one technical interview to a candidate, you make your decision solely based on that. It's roughly 60% as accurate as if you did 15 interviews. If you had a second interview onto that, you get a little bit more, et cetera, et cetera. But you really see that begin to plateau around like 4 to 5 interviews. So if you do 4 to 5 interviews or you do 9 interviews, you're not really making better decisions. You're just spending more time from the candidate and from the interviewers. And so now it's kind of optimized from a data standpoint to 4 or 5. So that's one change that was made, in the last 20 years. In the last 5 years, the thing that's really changed is the reintroduction of soft skills. Like the tradition, like if you just Google interview questions, you see a lot of these, like, tell me about a time where you were challenged or you worked with a coworker that you didn't get along with, or these types of things. And a lot of tech interviews for a very long period were purely technical. It was all system design and algorithms and data structures and coding, and had nothing to do with those kind of generic interview questions. And I think what people are discovering now is that, like, a large part of being a successful software engineer, especially the more senior that you get, has everything to do with soft skills more than technical skills. Like, you still need the technical skills, but if you look at 2 people that have equal technical skills, but one of them has those soft skills to be able to resolve conflict and communicate and do those sorts of things, like, that person is going to be more senior over the course of their career. And so even like at Google now, we're starting to incorporate those sort of soft skill interviews to sort of like judge, does the person have the soft skills necessary to reach those more senior positions? And so I think you're seeing somewhat of a comeback in the industry with those soft skill questions now, which is the biggest change that I've seen in the last 5 years.
Super interesting. Patrick?
Yeah, I would completely agree with that, actually. I mean, I think when I started interviewing, and then even back when I was interviewing 5+ years ago, I think it was definitely much more technical heavy, where you were just doing different coding tests every night, and it would be maybe I need to solve this problem versus this problem, and you might not even get asked soft skills in the interview. And I think where we are right now with HomeAdvisor is, I would say, about half the interview process is probably geared more towards soft skills and understanding more about communication and just what your style of work is, rather than just your technical ability. We'll have a lot of people come in that might have fantastic technical ability, but if it doesn't seem like they might be able to communicate, or they might have trouble working in a team specific environment, or not very interested in like testing, or then that might end up being a red flag or a no for us. So I would agree. I think definitely big transition that way. And I think the take-home tests have gone down, in my opinion, over the last X number of years. I think even at HomeAdvisor, where historically we've done a lot of take-home tests, we're starting to gear it less and less into making the take-home tests as easy as possible. And in terms of, they're just answering the question, do you know how to code, basically? And if you know how to code real quick, then that's great. We will dig into the rest during some of the soft skills architecture type interviews instead.
I think one quick point where they're saying is, like, if somebody knows how to program in Ruby but they don't know Java, it's easy to teach them Ruby. Teaching somebody how to communicate or how to have some of these soft skills, that is a much more difficult thing to teach somebody. And I think that's why soft skills are making kind of this, like, playing a larger role in the interview process, is because it's just harder to teach people those skills. And so by filtering out those skills in the interview process, you're going to have a stronger base of employees.
Interesting. Any kind of final thoughts, Brooke?
Oh no, that's fantastic. Sorry, is it Caleb that's the first speaker? Sorry, I haven't been able to put sounds to names yet.
Yeah, I was asking the question about performing work, like kind of in a whiteboard situation.
Yeah, but Patrick and Paul are the kind of other panelists with you. So Paul was just speaking, and then Patrick.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. No. Sorry, Paul. I totally missed your name there at the beginning. But yeah, Paul and Patrick, like, you're really nailing it on the head there, which is the coming back of the softer skills, because I really can't stress enough, like, you do need to have your technical chops, right? But that's kind of like the bar, right? But where you want to see candidates, especially, for me too, when hiring others, is all of those things that go into the communication skills. It's the communication, It's the empathy and the ability just to be a good human to another human. All those things that really help the team gel across the board, not just your team members, but dealing with like the product team, dealing with the CEO, or even your customers if you end up in a customer-facing situation. Like if you can carry yourself with dignity and professionalism and understand where the other person's coming from, that is massively huge. And again, just like I was saying before, just being a good communicator, both in terms of being able to speak elegantly, understand the problem, talk about the problem, think it through, but also, in writing, because, I know I've been hammering this a little bit, but because I always focus on being remote, and again, half my career actually has been remote. But in these days, even with COVID, right, forcing everybody to be remote, I just really can't stress that enough. And just being able to have good communication skills, to be able to write the problem out, explain what it is, or ask good questions, and that just makes a huge difference when you're working with a team, especially a team that's asynchronous and kind of communicating, not in the same time zone, or even at different times of the day. It still keeps that team humming and gelling really well. So those just all really great points.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for the add on there. And I think kind of what Dan just asked is how come all job descriptions list the tech skills then? And that's a good seg into how do you write those job descriptions? And I haven't looked at job descriptions in a while. Are you adding soft skills to that list? What's that look like? Patrick, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, typically I don't really add the soft skills in terms of the job description. When I'm writing the job description itself, I'm thinking about like if the team is a puzzle, what are potential pieces of the puzzle that we really need to look for? So in the case of, and those might change based on different team members that come on or really what we're looking for. But when I'm writing job descriptions, it's more about like thinking about what would make this person successful in this role from a skills technology type standpoint, and then sussing out the soft skills more in that interview process. But making sure that like if I'm looking for someone who is more front end specific, and maybe we're moving more towards AWS or Firebase, so they have some of those cloud skills as well as this. And I think I keep the job descriptions from more generic standpoint, and then suss out the soft skills further down the road.
Okay. Paul?
Yeah, so I don't actually write any job descriptions for any of our roles, but I can say that like I think that the soft skills are generally something that scale with level. And so, like hiring a fresh graduate, there's a certain level of soft skills that you kind of expect. But like, to me, like if you're hiring for a senior role, then it's kind of implicit in the fact that it's a senior role, that there's a certain set of soft skills that accompany that to be able to perform that role adequately. Just like, there's a lot of technical skills that aren't going to be mentioned in the job description itself that you would just kind of expect like you wouldn't list like unit testing or something, but you would expect a senior engineer to be able to perform that. I will say I would be very hesitant about adding additional bullet points to a job description. Specifically because there's a lot of research that shows that the more bullet points that you add to a job description, the smaller your applicant pool gets from a diversity standpoint. So I think actually minimizing the job descriptions and making them shorter is the direction that the industry should move in, rather than listing out all the possible attributes that they would be looking for.
Patrick or Brooke, anything to add there?
Oh yeah, I'll just jump in quick. Yeah, I just wanted to back up Paul on that. I think that's another thing I wanted to emphasize too, is that I keep it really simple, right? It's just a form with like your name, email, location, portfolio, and your salary requirements. And then maybe any additional notes you might want to add. And that's it. You just submit that. We list, like what we're looking for, technical and so forth. Just kind of talk about the stack a little bit in the technical requirements, right? Obviously if me being Ruby, you need to have Ruby chops, but that's it. Because as long as I can get your portfolio and resume, I can kind of dig into that, and I can kind of, I can look through that stuff and kind of get a sense of, if you meet some of the requirements that we're looking for. And then, then it's into like, okay, well, let's get together. Let's have a first meet and greet. And then after that, bring you in. So yeah, I try to keep it as simple as possible, like Paul was saying, because you want to not have a high barrier. You want it for people, you want to be able to attract talent and make it almost seem effortlessly for them to actually sign up and join you, is the big thing there.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one thing I started doing as well is like maybe not even focusing on a specific language. So even though HomeAdvisor, our tech stack is Java for most of our APIs, I'll put on job descriptions like looking for Java or C# or equivalent or something that could translate well to Java, just because at the point where you're writing the job descriptions, yeah, it's just about attracting as many people as you can and making sure that you can get a large diverse pool into the door basically.
Pretty well. I think we have only a few more minutes, Dan. I don't think we have a hard stop, but probably an hour is about good.
Yeah, we want to be respectful of everyone's time.
Okay, if we could there's two final questions, so let's try to keep the answers a little bit brief if you can. The first one is a little loaded because it's what is fit and how do you find it as a candidate in a company? So I don't know if that's going to be short or not, but I think it's an interesting question to ask. I think we've kind of covered it too, but if you have any other final thoughts or like, oh, that's something that I think about in this way, that would be an interesting add-on to things we've already discussed.
Yeah, so I think for me, it's that question of like, would I be comfortable with this person working next to me? Which that doesn't mean that your code doesn't have syntax errors, because we all rely on compilers and other things to find that. If you forget whether it's array.list or array.size or array.length, like that's not I'm not going to dock you a lot in an interview for that, because I don't care, because me and my coworkers make the exact same mistakes. And so like those things don't matter, but what does matter is like, how do you thrive in ambiguity? Like as we start talking about the question, the technical question, do you get excited about it? Like, is there this spark of like, all of a sudden the stress of the interview goes away to some extent and you really just want to find a solution because it's interesting to you, like that's a positive signal. Because that's, like fundamentally as programmers, we're just, well-paid problem solvers for the most part. So finding people that like really enjoy solving problems and have a good approach to solving problems, that's by far the best fit. Whether you don't know any Java, like that's fine. Like I'll still hire you for a Java role because I can teach you Java. Like I can't teach you how to be excited about problem solving or how to thrive in ambiguous problems, but I can teach you Java. And so it's those sort of signals that I'm looking for that I think make you a good fit.
Great. Patrick, any additional fit sort of related thoughts?
No, I don't. I mean, nothing. I don't think that we haven't really covered. I think the main thing for fit from a candidate side is sometimes as well, if you're interviewing and you might get turned down for the job, it might not be because you weren't qualified for the job or anything like that. You might just have not fit what that team or what that company was looking for at that time. I had a candidate yesterday who was fantastic backend developer and would have been great, but I already have a fantastic backend developer and I kind of need someone a little stronger on the front end. And so sometimes you can interview, have someone that's perfect, but it just doesn't fit within what the team or what the mold is looking for.
Great. Brooke, any kind of short thoughts on fit?
Yeah, nothing more than what the panelists have said and kind of what I've said before. The main thing just being that emphasis on being a strong learner, a good person that likes to ask questions, and just being compassionate and empathetic towards your fellow teammates really goes a huge, huge way. One thing I will say though, to kind of tack on to what Patrick was saying there, is what I like to do at the end of the interview in a case where a candidate doesn't meet the criteria, and that's okay. I like to give them feedback as to like, well, look, this is why you didn't make it through, and these are the areas that you could probably improve upon, and encourage them to come back. And the reason I emphasize this is it adds a lot of goodwill to that candidate, even if they didn't get the job, because that helps from a marketing standpoint to know that, hey, this is a culture that really cares about the people that they're hiring and who they're bringing into the team. And that word gets around, which also works as kind of a marketing tool, because other people in the community will perk up and they'll remember who those people are, who that company is, and they might actually want to apply or get it really excited. Or even better, that candidate might come back later with the skills that we need, and we're super happy to bring them in. Or if not, they'll just spread the word to their friends and through the social network, right? Which is really nice way to get other people to perk up and realize, hey, this is a really good company to work for. They might have a good high standard bar, but they'll be excited to try to apply there, which is another nice side effect of good interview practices.
It's interesting, sort of the skill of letting people down softly and giving constructive feedback. Like,
yeah,
crunched up when you said that, like, ooh, that's confrontational, but it's not really supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be like a helpful thing.
Yeah, just make it as, because interviewing is hard, right? It's hard. It can be stressful for people, and just treat them as other humans with respect and kindness, right? And like I said, it just goes a long way, and it's just a nice way to give back to the community as well.
Sure. Great. Any more thoughts, Paul or Patrick, on that specific kind of wrap up? I think we've got it covered, but I want to make sure to give you time.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add there.
Great. Patrick's good as well. Perfect. Okay, so sort of to end on a light note, are there any funny interviewing stories or horror stories you can share that might be interesting, just sort of as a final kind of thought?
Well, I've had a few people come in, sit down, look at the question, and then just kind of say, nope, I'm out. I don't want to do this. And they'll be in within about 5 minutes. I think the one real big horror story though is, and he is okay, I should preface this, but he was okay. But he came in and I think he hadn't realized what to expect, and he ended up having heart issues at the very start of the interview, and we had to get an ambulance in and make sure he was okay. But I don't think it was a heart attack, but it was close. But it was pretty rough, and especially for him, and obviously, but I think it was an interesting learning lesson, especially from my point, because it was kind of like, well, clearly here's someone, he was coming in, he was clearly very uncomfortable. So like, we obviously need to adjust our process to make people more comfortable coming in, because if it's this stressful, we're doing something very wrong. So we tried to adjust our process wholesale and like make sure people had a better idea about what the interview process was, and clearly outline what we were looking for and a little bit better. And so definitely made us revamp how we were thinking about it from the candidate standpoint.
Very interesting and surprising. I'm glad he's okay.
He's okay, yes.
Yeah, I actually don't have any horror stories. Like, my interviewing experiences have been, surprisingly normal, I guess. Yeah, I mean, generally, all the candidates come in and do relatively well or exceptionally well. Yeah, it's been a very, I don't know, I guess mundane process from the most part, from my standpoint.
Better than a guy having half a heart attack on your watch. Brooke, do you have any funny or interviewing horror stories?
No, I'm afraid I don't. Most of them have been pretty even going. The only thing is, every now and then somebody's just not prepared, right? Like they have technical issues with their camera or their audio, which is always a little disappointing, but that's about it, really.
That's good.
I have one funny one that I could kind of end on a high note for, where we were interviewing for, basically it was kind of like this C# type role. And I like asking candidates about what their comfort level is 1 to 10 before we start the interview, to kind of see where they believe they're at. And he was great, where I'd be like, okay, where are you scale of 1 to 10 on C#? It's like, I'm a 10, easy. Okay, JavaScript, easily a 10. And all the way through. So I'd start with kind of the easier questions and work our way through, okay, what's the difference between public and private. You'd be like, next question, pass. Okay, what is an abstract class? Next question, keep going. And I think we went through, I don't think he was able to answer a single one of the kind of the questions, despite answering a 10 on every single thing. And it was tough because at the very end of it, he was like, I didn't do very well, did I? And so we got a little work to do, but here's the things you can work on. Here's how you can do this going forward.
Nice. That's
Definitely a 10 on confidence. It sounds like that guy.
He was super confident. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Patrick, and Paul, and Brooke for your time. Super appreciate it. And Annie for weighing in. We appreciate her as well. And thanks everybody for being here. We appreciate all of your time and commitment to the community. It's super helpful and enjoyable to be a part of. Anything else that we have, Dan? All good.
We'll be having a couple of talks next month. I think that it'll be up on the website. I've got them lined up. I think they're a little less soft skills and more technical next month. So